There is a moment that anyone who watched rugby in the winter of 1995 keeps folded away somewhere in the back of the mind. And it goes like this. Cape Town, Newlands, a semi-final against England, and a young man with a number 11 on his back takes the ball near the halfway line and simply does not stop. Tony Underwood is brushed aside. Will Carling drifts across too late. And then there is Mike Catt, planting himself in the path of the thing that is coming, doing everything he was ever taught to do, and the thing runs straight over the top of him, as though he were a length of garden hose left lying on the grass. Catt goes down, the young man goes on, and by the time he plants the ball behind the line, the sport of rugby union has quietly stopped being one thing and become another. He was 20 years old. His name was Jonah Lomu, and he had a secret he had not yet told a soul, a secret that would eventually take everything from him, including his life, at an age when most men are only beginning to understand what they have. You would not have guessed any of it from the smile. That was the thing people always came back to, the ones who met him. Here was a man built on a scale that made grown forwards look ordinary, 120-odd kilograms of muscle set on a frame near enough to 2 meters, and yet the abiding memory was almost always of gentleness. A soft voice, a shyness even. A boy who signed autographs until the last child had gone home and then gave his boots away to whoever happened to be standing nearest. To understand how those two things lived in the same body, the freight train and the gentle giant, you have to go back before the black jersey, before Newlands, back to a weatherboard state house in Māngere, and a childhood that had no business producing a national treasure at all. He was born on the 12th of May, 1975, at Pukekohe, south of Auckland, to parents who had come across the water from the Ha'apai Islands of Tonga in search of the ordinary things immigrants everywhere come looking for. His father, Samisi, worked in a factory and carried his faith and his discipline like a pair of heavy tools he did not always know how to set down. His mother, Hepi, held the household together and stood for years in the narrow and dangerous space between a hard man and his children. When Jonah was barely a year old, he was sent back across the ocean to Tonga to be raised by an aunt on Ha'apai, and for the first years of his life, it was that aunt he thought of as his mother, the warm sand of Holopeka, the whole of the world he knew. When he came back to New Zealand, close to 7 years old, he came back to a place that must have felt like another planet entirely, and to a father he barely recognized, and a family whose rhythms he had to learn from the outside in. Those first years on Ha'apai left their own kind of mark, though it was a softer one. Holopeka was a village of coral sand and coconut palms, and the long, slow tempo of island life. A world away from the concrete and the cold of South Auckland. And a small boy raised there, among relatives who loved him, absorbed something of the Pacific he never lost. A courtesy, a stillness, a way of holding himself that people would later mistake for shyness, and that was really something closer to the manners of an older culture, carried intact into a harder new one. He spoke Tongan before he spoke much English, and spoke it fluently all his life. And when he became famous, he became, without ever quite setting out to, a figure of enormous pride for Pacific Island people everywhere. Proof that a Tongan boy from a family with nothing could stand at the very center of the world's attention and not be diminished by it. That meant more, in the end, than any of the tries. There were Islander children across New Zealand and across the Pacific who looked at Jonah Lomu and understood, some of them for the first time, that the door was not closed to them either. The Māngere of Jonah's boyhood was not the Māngere of tourist brochures. It was a working suburb where Tongan and Samoan and Maori families lived close and hard, where rival gangs marked their ground in ways that sometimes ended in blood, and where a boy who was already enormous by the age of 12 learned quickly that his size was a currency and his fists a form of speech. He would say later, without much drama about it, that an uncle and a friend were both killed with knives during those years. One of them, David Foucault, hacked down in a shopping centre in 1988 in an act of violence so senseless it seemed to redraw the boundaries of what the world was capable of. Jonah drifted toward the edges. He ran with a group that stole cars and hurt people. He came home, more than once, in the back of a police car. There was, he admitted many years afterward, a version of his life that ended in a prison cell, or in a mortuary, and it was not a distant or improbable version. It was the road he was already on. And at home, there was the other war. Samisi, when he drank, became a different man, and the blows fell on Hepi and on the children. Jonah spoke about this only late in life, in the autobiography he finally allowed to be written, and even then, he spoke about it the way you speak about weather that has passed, though you can hear in the words how deep the marks went. He said his father was the best dad he could be, except when the drink was in him, and that when it was, the two of them could not be in the same room. There came a night, the boy 15 and already close to the size of a man, when he watched his mother being hurt one time too many, and he lifted his own father off the ground and threw him across the room. And that was the end of them, for a long while. He was put out of the family home. He did not speak to his father for years. It was one of those fractures that runs right through a life, and Jonah carried it in a way that was almost useful and almost unbearable at once. He said, in an interview near the end, that when a match got hard, when his body was failing and the line seemed impossibly far away, he would think of his father and let the old anger carry him over. That anger, he said flatly, got me through it. There is a whole world of pain compressed into a sentence like that. It was Hepi who saw the cliff edge coming and turned him from it. After the murder of David Foucault, she made a decision that probably saved everything, and enrolled her son as a boarder at Wesley College, a Methodist school with a long reputation for discipline, for values, and, though she cannot have cared much about this part, for producing rugby players out of Polynesian boys nobody else had bothered to look at properly. It did not go smoothly at first. The story goes that within 2 hours of arriving, Jonah was in detention for fighting, which surprised no one who knew where he had come from. But the headmaster, a man named Chris Grinter, understood something about the boy that the streets had only ever punished. He gave Jonah a key to the school gymnasium and told him to take his temper out on a punch bag rather than on a person, and he steered him, gently, toward rugby union, first as a lock forward, wedged into the engine room where boys of that size were supposed to go. That should have been the end of the story, or at least the shape of it. A very big Tongan boy, a second rower, a life of honest grinding work at the bottom of rucks. But there was the other thing about Jonah, the thing that made no sense on paper and less sense in the flesh, which was that he could run. Not run for a big man. Run. Timed at the 100 meters in something close to 10.5 seconds, a sprinter's time carried inside a lock-forward's body. And it was this impossible combination that a schoolmaster's eye eventually recognized and shifted out wide, onto the wing, where there was space enough for the freak of nature to hit full stride before anyone could get near him. By his final year at Wesley, he was head boy of the school and captain of the first XV, leading from number 8, a boy who had arrived as a problem and was leaving as a leader. 12 months after that, he was in a black jersey, tearing down the touchline in a test match, the youngest man ever to wear one. The rise, once it began, had a velocity that matched the man. He announced himself to the wider world at the Hong Kong Sevens in early 1994, 18 years old and running through international opposition as though the format had been invented specifically to display him. All that pace and power with acres of room to use it. The selectors could not ignore what they were seeing. On the 26th of June 1994, against France at Christchurch, Jonah Lomu became an All Black at 19 years and 45 days, the youngest in the long history of the side, breaking a record that had stood since 1905. It was not, in truth, an auspicious debut. He was raw, the French were canny, and the 2 tests he played that winter did not go the way of the men in black. There were those who wondered, briefly, whether the boy was a little too much brawn and not quite enough rugby. It is one of the sweeter ironies of his story that the answer arrived less than a year later on the biggest stage the game possessed, and that it silenced every doubt in the space of a single tournament. The 1995 World Cup in South Africa was already going to be a landmark before Jonah touched a ball. The first great sporting event of the new South Africa, Mandela newly at its head, a nation trying to become one thing in front of the world's cameras. Into that theatre walked a 20-year-old winger who proceeded to play the tournament of the century. He scored against Ireland, he scored against Scotland, and then came England in the semi-final at Cape Town, and the 90 seconds of rugby that changed his life and the trajectory of the whole sport. 4 tries in the one match, the first All Black to manage 4 against England since 1905, and the manner of them, the sheer physical impossibility of them, was what fixed him in the memory of everyone watching. The Mike Catt try became the single most replayed piece of rugby footage of its era. The image of a good and brave international fullback being run over as if he simply were not there. Gavin Hastings, the great Scotland captain, who had already had the misfortune of trying to stop him, said tackling Lomu was like trying to bring down a battering ram. Rob Andrew, the England fly-half, said years later that he was a bloomin' nightmare to play against, and worse still, that he smiled while he did it, so that grown internationals ended up chasing him around the field like children in a playground. What lingers, listening to the men who shared a field with him, is how little bitterness there is in any of it. You might expect the players who spent 80 minutes being flattened by Jonah Lomu to have carried some resentment out of the experience, and instead, almost to a man, they speak of him with a strange tenderness, as though being run over by him had been a kind of privilege, a story to tell the grandchildren. Part of that was the smile, the absolute absence of malice in the way he played. He hit you with everything he had, and then reached down to help you up. Part of it was the humility that his own teammates always mentioned first, the giving nature, the roommate on tour who was, in the phrase one of them used, such a giving bloke, forever handing away his possessions, forever more interested in other people than in himself. The men who knew him best inside the New Zealand camp described someone almost bashful about the fame, uncomfortable being singled out, happiest in the ordinary rhythms of the squad. It is a rare thing for a man to become the most famous player in the history of his sport, and to remain, in the dressing room, simply one of the boys. Jonah managed it. New Zealand lost the final, of course. That is the part the record books insist upon, and the part that ached. Extra time against the Springboks at Ellis Park, Joel Stransky's drop goal, a nation in green and gold rising as one, and the All Blacks, and Lomu, walking off as runners-up. There is a footnote to that final that stayed hidden for years, and that recolours everything once you know it, which is that a mysterious food poisoning illness swept through the New Zealand camp in the days before the match, leaving players weak and depleted. But that was not the only thing Jonah was carrying into that final and out of that tournament. He had begun to feel unwell in a way that had nothing to do with any dressing room bug. He was tired in a manner that rest did not fix. His body, the miraculous machine that had just remade a global sport, was quietly beginning to turn against him. The diagnosis, when it came at the end of 1995, was nephrotic syndrome, a serious disorder of the kidneys, and it arrived with the cruelty of perfect timing. Here was the most physically dominant athlete rugby had ever produced, a young man who had just become the most famous player alive, and inside him, an organ was failing. The treatment that followed was its own kind of ordeal. Dialysis, 3 times a week, the machine doing the filtering his own body could no longer manage, and the treatment itself so punishing that it damaged the nerves in his legs and feet, robbing the fastest man in the game of some of the very feeling in the limbs that had made him. For most of his career, from that point on, Jonah Lomu was playing sick. Every barnstorming run down the touchline in the years that followed was made by a man whose kidneys were dying, and almost nobody knew. He played on. That is the plain, astonishing fact at the heart of it. He came back and played on, and for a while he played as well as ever. It is worth pausing on what he actually was, physically, because the numbers have a way of sounding like exaggeration until you set them beside one another and let them do their work. Near enough to 1.96 m in height. Somewhere between 118 and 125 kilograms, depending on the year and the season, the sort of mass that in any other player would have been distributed across a lock forward whose job was to shove and to jump, and never, under any circumstances, to sprint. And laid over all of that bulk, 100 meters run in under 11 seconds. closer, on his best days, to 10.5. There were men in the All Black pack in 1995, big men, hard men, who were taller than Jonah, but not one of them was heavier, and none of them could have lived with him over 40 meters of open turf. Coaches had no framework for it. Defensive systems had been built, over a century of the game, around certain assumptions, that a big man would be slow, and a fast man would be small, that you could commit one tackler to the giant and back your covering speed against the flyer. And here was a single player who broke both halves of that arithmetic at once. He ran with a low center of gravity, which meant that even when a defender got low and did everything correctly, the contact simply drove that defender backward. He had a fend, a straight-arm push, that could stop a grown international dead and fold him to the ground. And when brute force was not required, he could swerve, subtly, at pace, a shift of the hips that left tacklers grasping at the air where he had been. The game responded to him the only way it could, by evolving. Within a few short years, every side in world rugby was hunting for wingers who carried size as well as speed, and the position Jonah had inherited as a place for quick, light, elusive men was permanently rebuilt in his image. He did not just play the wing better than anyone before him, he changed what the wing was for. There were more great days. At the 1999 World Cup, he was, if anything, even more devastating, scoring 8 tries across the tournament, a single tournament record, including 2 against a French side in a semi-final that New Zealand contrived to lose from a position of command, 43-31, in one of the great collapses in the game's history. His 15 World Cup tries stood as a record until Brian Habana finally equaled it in that same year Jonah died. And there is something fitting, in a melancholy way, about the 2 marks sitting level. He never did lift a trophy. Twice he was the best player at a World Cup, and twice he went home without the thing everyone assumed a man like that must surely win. It is one of the quiet lessons his career keeps teaching, that greatness and its rewards do not always arrive in the same envelope, and that a man can change a sport forever and still be denied its single most coveted prize. There is a larger thing his 1995 tournament did that is easy to overlook now, cushioned as we are by decades of professional rugby, with its salaries and its sponsors and its stadiums full of paying crowds. When Jonah ran over Mike Catt, the game was still officially amateur. Players held down jobs. The whole creaking edifice of rugby union was poised at the very edge of turning professional, unsure whether the money and the audiences existed to make such a leap survivable. And there were plenty of hardheads convinced it would all end in ruin. And then a 20-year-old from Māngere gave the sport something it had never possessed. A single figure recognizable far beyond the game's own borders. A face that could sell the whole enterprise to people who had never watched a ruck in their lives. The timing was almost providential. Rugby went professional within months of that World Cup, and it did so carried on a wave of global attention that Jonah, more than any administrator or any television deal, had personally generated. It is not too much to say that the modern professional game was launched on his shoulders, that the wealth which now sloshes through the sport exists in part because one young man made the world look up from whatever it was doing and pay attention. That he saw so little of that wealth himself by the end is one of the story's harder ironies, and one it does not do to look away from. Away from the field, the money and the fame arrived in the way they arrive for very few, and they brought their own confusions. He turned down offers that would have made him wealthy beyond the imagination of the boy from the State House in Māngere. There was rugby league circling and gridiron, whispers of the NFL wanting to see what that body could do on an American field, and a reported £1 million a season on the table from Bristol in England after the 1999 tournament. He said no, and stayed, and played for New Zealand for a fraction of what he might have earned elsewhere, because the black jersey meant something to him that money never quite could. He had the ear of presidents and the friendship of film stars. Robin Williams putting on an All Blacks cap and calling him mate, Nelson Mandela himself among his admirers. He carried his passport to sporting events as a boy because officials refused to believe a child could be that size. Now he carried a global fame that no rugby player had ever known, an immigrant son from the Ha'apai Islands recognized on the streets of Tokyo and Milan and London. But fame is a poor manager of a private life, and Jonah's private life was as turbulent as his running was smooth. He married young and often, and the marriages tell their own story of a man reaching, again and again, for a stability that had been missing from the very beginning. In 1996, only 20 years old, he married Tanya Rutter, a South African woman he had met on tour, in a ceremony on the shores of the Manukau harbour. His own parents were not invited, a wound in the family that made headlines and that spoke of how deep the rift with his father still ran. He would say later, with the rueful honesty of a man looking back at his younger self, that he had simply been too young, that he was 20 and she was 19, and he had thought, the way the young do, that this was the real and final thing. It was not. They divorced in 2000. In 2003, he married again, Fiona Taylor, in a secret ceremony on Waiheke Island, and again his family were left off the guest list, and again the papers made much of it. Fiona became his manager as well as his wife, taking a firm hand on the finances of a man who had never in his life been taught to hold on to money, and for 4 years they were spoken of as the golden couple of New Zealand rugby. It ended in 2008 in the messiest way imaginable, in a tangle of infidelity that played out across the front pages. Jonah had begun a relationship with Nadine Quirk, herself newly married to a young blues player, and the collapse of 2 marriages became public property, complete with a wronged husband speaking to the papers and a nation feasting on the details. It was not Jonah's finest hour, and he knew it, and he mostly declined to talk about it. But there is a temptation, looking at that stretch of his life, to see only the tabloid mess, and that would be to miss the sadder and truer thing underneath, which is that here was a man who had never once, from the age of 1, known what a settled and safe home felt like, and who kept trying to build one, and kept getting it wrong, and kept trying again. With Nadine, at last, something held. They married, and they had 2 sons, Brayley and Darrell, and by every account, the last stretch of his life, for all its mounting troubles, was the one in which he finally became the thing his own father had so rarely managed to be. A present father, a gentle one. The body, though, kept its own remorseless schedule. By 2003, the kidneys had deteriorated to the point where his rugby career, as a serious international enterprise, was effectively over. In 2004, he underwent a transplant, and the story of that transplant is one of the most quietly moving things in the whole of his life. The kidney came from Grant Kediyama, a Wellington radio presenter, a friend, a man who simply offered up a part of his own body so that Jonah might keep living. It is a measure of the kind of loyalty Jonah inspired in people that a friend would do such a thing, and a measure of how far the illness had gone that doctors warned him he risked ending up in a wheelchair if he delayed the operation any longer. He tried, even then, to come back. He always tried to come back. He played a little for Cardiff in Wales, a little for North Harbour, later a spell in France with a lower division side at Marseille, chasing the game long after the game had, in truth, let him go. He never regained the old level. How could he? The body that had done those impossible things at Newlands was gone, replaced by a body that was fighting simply to keep going. He formally gave up on a return to the top in 2007, at 32, when no Super Rugby contract was forthcoming, and the great career, which had never really had a proper ending, was allowed to fade out quietly rather than finish with a flourish. What came after was harder than most people knew at the time. The transplanted kidney did not last. The medical bills mounted. And the money, the enormous sums that had once flowed toward the most marketable man in world rugby, had drained away with the terrible efficiency of a fortune that no one had ever been trained to protect. There were business ventures that failed. There were property investments that soured. There were, by the end, loans and debts and a mansion sold, and a man who had once been said to be worth $15 million, living, in his final years, closer to the edge than anyone would have imagined possible. He was generous to a fault, which is a kind way of saying he gave money and gear away without much thought for tomorrow, handing his beatboxes to the hotel cleaners at the end of a stay, pressing his belongings on people after training. It was the same open-handedness that had made him beloved, and it left him, at the last, with very little. When he died, it emerged that his affairs were in such a state that the New Zealand rugby community moved to set up a trust for his two young sons, because the man who had done more than anyone alive to make their sport rich had not managed to leave his own children secure. The years after the game were quieter, and quiet was never the natural element of a man built for stadiums. There is a particular loneliness that comes to athletes when the roar stops, when the body that defined them will no longer do the one thing it was famous for. And Jonah's version of that loneliness was sharpened by illness and by money worries and by the ordinary difficulty of working out who you are once the thing you were is finished. He filled the space as best he could. He worked as an ambassador for the game, lending his name and his gentle presence to sevens tournaments and junior competitions, a familiar giant signing autographs long after the professional contracts had dried up. He threw himself into being a father, which by every account he did with a devotion that suggested he was trying to give his sons the settled childhood he himself had never been handed. But there were long stretches in those final years of a man waiting on dialysis machines and specialists' appointments, watching a body that had once been the wonder of the sporting world require constant tending simply to keep functioning, and knowing, because the doctors did not hide it from him, that the transplant which had bought him time would not buy him a great deal of it. He rarely complained. That was not his way. But you sense, in the accounts of those years, a man quietly running out of the one resource he had always possessed in such abundance, which was time on his feet. And through it all, the smaller humanities kept surfacing, the things that had nothing to do with rugby at all. He loved languages, and taught himself pieces of French and Spanish and Mandarin and Cantonese, and even, it is said, some Russian, an immigrant's son endlessly curious about other people's words. He and Nadine joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He became, improbably for a man once known to police as a teenage tearaway, a member of a club of athletes devoted to promoting peace. He reconciled in the end with the father who had beaten him in the last years before Samisi died in 2012, the two of them finding some measure of peace before it was too late, which is the sort of ending a life so full of fracture does not always grant. He looked after his parents financially even during the years they were estranged, buying them a home, protecting their privacy, a son doing quietly for his father what his father had struggled to do for him. On the 18th of November 2015, at his home in Auckland, Jonah Lomu died of a heart attack linked to the kidney disease that had shadowed him for 20 years. He was 40. He had flown home only shortly before, having been in Britain around the World Cup, watching the All Blacks win the thing he himself had twice been denied. And there is something almost unbearable in that timing, that he saw them lifted at last and then came home to die. He left Nadine and he left Brayley and Darrell, 6 and 5 years old, who walked behind his hearse in black shirts bearing the number 11, the number their father had made his own, the number that used to mean nothing in particular, and now, because of him, meant a man who could not be stopped. The tributes came from everywhere and from everyone, from a queen and from a parliament, from the great players who had spent their careers being run over by him and had somehow come to love him for it, from children at his old primary school who performed a haka for a man most of them had never met. Thousands filled Eden Park, the spiritual home of the game in New Zealand, to say goodbye. Peter Fitzsimons, who watched him as closely as anyone, called him a freight train in ballet shoes, and reached, in the end, for the only description that ever really fitted, which was that other players could go through you, or other players could go around you, but Lomu could do both, and did, and no one before or since has done it quite the same way. There is a temptation, whenever a life ends young and full of both triumph and disaster, to reach for the word tragedy and to let it do the work. But that word does not quite hold him either. Tragedy suggests waste, a life that failed to become itself, and Jonah's did not fail. A boy who by rights should have died on the streets of Māngere or disappeared into a prison, instead remade a global sport, provided for a family that had given him little, reconciled with a father who had given him less, and left behind two sons who will grow up knowing that the whole world once stopped to watch what their dad could do with a rugby ball and a stretch of open grass. That he did all of it while quietly dying, that he never got to hold the trophy, that the money ran out and the body gave out, and the ending came far too soon. All of that is true, and all of it hurts. But it does not diminish him. If anything, it makes the running seem more extraordinary, not less. That every one of those unstoppable strides was made by a man who had every reason to stop and simply chose, again and again, not to. Somewhere there is still a boy, 12 years old and already the size of a man, letting himself into a school gymnasium with a key a kind headmaster gave him, hitting a punch bag until the anger loosens its grip, not knowing yet that the world is waiting for him, that a stadium in Cape Town is waiting, that an entire sport is about to be handed over to him, and then, far too cruelly and far too soon, taken back. You watch the old footage now, and it is grainy, and the years have gone by, and the men who chased him are grey. And still, every single time, when he takes the ball near the halfway line and puts his head down and begins to move, some part of you leans forward, half hoping, against everything you already know, that this time somebody finds a way to bring him down before he reaches the line. Nobody ever did. And that, perhaps, is exactly how he would have wanted to be remembered.